So yes, I was lucky enough to do a PhD placement at the British Library before Christmas. I spent 3 months with Jerry as my supervisor, which was so much fun. And I basically was let loose in the British Library, and I could look at their resources, look at their systems, and just really think about what's happening with collection development and acquisition, specifically relating to artist books and fine press publishing. So I'll just, yeah, there we go. So the primary purpose of this placement was to assess the extent to which the library's collecting practices reflect the diversity of artists and publishers in the UK and Ireland. So initially, the intention was to consider regional diversity and ethnic diversity across the contemporary scene. During the course of the placement, I realized that answering questions related to diversity raised really important considerations. So thinking about ethnic diversity, and then also when I started to think about class diversity, gender and sexuality, it seemed really important to follow artists and publishers' own self-descriptions and not to impose any language or impose any categories that might reflect my own biases. But because a lot of this information isn't shared publicly by artists and publishers, it proved really challenging to actually collect it. And I sort of thought about if there was a survey where we could sort of speak directly to people, ask them how they would position themselves. It ended up not being in the scope of the project to sort of go in that way. I realized very early on that this project was going to be based on publicly available information. So instead of measuring ethnic diversity directly, to avoid making any assumptions or imposing any language, I collected data where it was available. So I used artist websites, I used social media profiles where the work was maybe intentionally engaging with an artist's marginalized identity or their heritage or their experiences of class background. I was able to record that and collect information on ethos. But eventually, it became clear that regional diversity was really the only one that could be tracked in a sort of pinpointed in a very sort of objective way. So I was able to record publisher locations. I was able to use artist websites to really figure out where people are based, where these publishing hubs, where these sort of centers for artist books are coming from. I didn't go as far as being able to track down people's addresses, but I did end up with postcodes. I ended up with very small villages. It was really fascinating seeing where these artists are clustering and where they're not clustering. I think it was important to note that I was always thinking about this data set as something that might be used by a future researcher. I was trying to anticipate different questions that might be asked by others in the future. So really, I was just trying to collect as much detail as possible. It was basically a really big spreadsheet, recording every facet of information I could find about artists making artist books or fine press publishers. So the other element of this was thinking about acquisitions. How does place of publication impact on acquisition? Whose work is being collected? Whose work is coming through legal deposit? And whose work is being purchased? So that sort of brought in a different element where I was thinking about, you know, the price range of different artist books and whose work is being paid for, essentially. So all of that data ended up going in as well. And finally, the project really highlighted the importance of understanding the perception of the British Library, you know, our artist bookmakers seeing the British Library as a home for their work. And I found this really interesting just as I started to get to grips with the artist book scene, thinking about whether an artwork is in a museum behind a glass, sort of a glass screen, whether that's really the place for a book, which we sort of instinctively want to read and we want to touch. And I can understand, having been here over the last few days, these are questions that you're all thinking about all the time. So that felt really, really important. Would an artist see the British Library as a home for their work? Very briefly, just in terms of my methods and sources, I was looking at book fairs. So they were the main data source for this project. I used event flyers, pamphlets, promotional materials, exhibitor lists. I would also, for some sort of one-off, more sort of niche artist book events in previous years, I ended up having to go through artist CVs to figure out where have people been, going through really sort of, you know, far down Instagram feeds, figuring out, okay, what was this artist doing 10 years ago, and where were they traveling to, and how far did they go? And I was also fortunate enough to go on 2 field trips to the Small Publishers Fair at Conway Hall in Bloomsbury and the Dublin Art Book Fair at the Temple Bar Gallery. So these became 2 really useful case studies. So that's just a very brief overview of UK and Ireland-based presses. So I excluded exhibitors that weren't artist bookmakers, small presses, or were based internationally, just to give a sense of the sort of regional makeup when you're using a book fair as a sort of window into acquisition. So one of the assumptions I had was that online provision might actually improve regional representation, and that maybe post-COVID, we would see a big shift. I imagined that being able to present remotely might have opened up opportunities to presses and artists who might be based in more remote locations and who might not be willing or able to travel to London. But actually, it ended up being more complicated than that. So using Scotland as an example here, there were actually, as expected, more Scottish presses who participated in 2021 when the Small Publishers Fair was hosted online. But actually, when you track where those artists have been, you realize that all but one of these presses were already regular exhibitors pre-COVID. So there was only one Scottish press, Stitchell Marigold, who exhibited online in 21 without having been previously. So it actually only opened it up to one Scottish press. The same was true of the increase in representation from Wales and the Republic of Ireland. These weren't sort of anomalies that could be attributed to online provision. These were artists and publishers who were already sort of enmeshed in this community. So essentially, rather than revealing anything about online provision and regional representation opportunities, it actually did more to highlight just how close-knit these scenes are. That when you go to a book fair, it's a real community that's sort of grown up around these regular meetings, and they all often work together, they're often friends. And I think the sense that I got was that because artist books are so material and tactile, online provision doesn't actually equate to accessibility for a lot of these artists. I can imagine that if you have poured that amount of work into something that really demands to be held, the thought of showing it online wouldn't necessarily be, favorable to traveling. But it was actually a fantastic experience going to the fair and being in the room. I was able to go with Jerry, and it was fantastic actually just seeing how pleased the artists were to see him. I hope you don't mind me saying that there's a sort of a real sort of sense of collaboration and friendship and interest that, the British Library have been able to develop these links. So that's come from it being in London and having that close proximity. So very briefly, just to think about proportions of representation, on the left, that reflects the regions represented at the Small Publishers Fair, and here on the right, that reflects the regions represented across the British Library's artist books and small press holdings. The red bar, which you can probably imagine, is London-based artists. So the close-knit nature of these communities can sort of be a double-edged sword when it comes to acquisition. You've got a great sense of collaboration and support, but there's also a chance that some other artists might be excluded. Depending on their background, depending on their region, they might feel that there's a challenge in terms of access here. Obviously, capital cities are always going to have higher density of artists and publishers, so it sort of makes sense that the reflection is here. But I felt that the symmetry between this one particular fair and the British Library was really interesting because it really speaks to where a lot of these artists are based. Moving on to somewhere a little bit different is the Dublin Art Book Fair. So the Dublin Art Book Fair was held at Temple Bar Art Gallery in November, December 2022. That's briefly, you can see sort of a similar proportion in terms of breakdown, but with the Republic of Ireland being much more heavily weighted. Interestingly, only 16% of exhibitors here are sort of have their work acquired by the British Library. So every publisher fair has a different character and a different approach. This is always shaped by the work that's included, the target audience, the curator, the hosting location. Dublin Art Book Fair is a really useful point of contrast because I felt that it really reflected the visual art side of artist books more so than the sort of publishing side. So it ran for a week. It had events, it had walking tours, it had film screenings, it had talks. It was much quieter during my visit because the sort of visits from the public were spread out. You had a lot of time to spend with the works that were provided on the tables. Whereas Conway Hall was very busy, you couldn't really get to grips with things for a very long time because there was always someone sort of behind you waiting their turn at the table. But one really major difference was that in Dublin, they don't have any artists or press representatives actually present in the room. I realized I arrived on the first day as it opened, and I suddenly realized that everything here was actually for sale, some of which there were only 1 or 2 copies. So if someone else had come and bought a book, I might not have ever seen it. So I realized I had to be quite quick and make a record of everything that was there as quickly as possible before it started to disappear. And it also meant that I couldn't speak to any artists. I couldn't sort of ask any questions about the artist book scene in Ireland. So that felt a little bit like a missed opportunity. Because they had these long tables, they were able to have explanatory notes and location details provided. So there was quite a lot of information I could gather. But some of the works were just sort of presented without any information beyond a name. Some of them were from smaller artists or student artists who, some of them didn't even have websites. So it became very difficult to really collect any information about who was producing these works and where they were based. So I had to be quite selective in the way that I measured my statistics. And there was a lot of work I sort of had to exclude because it didn't really fall into the remit of what we were thinking about in terms of the artist book. So I think for these reasons, it really felt more like a visual art space rather than a traditional book fair as we had in London. So I just want to sort of highlight all these differences because while these insights are useful, I think there are a few caveats to keep in mind, just that they're sort of quite different events with different functions and perhaps different target audiences. I think Dublin Art Book Fair felt much more geared towards the public. You could sort of walk in, it was in the city centre, off the street, and buy a book and leave without ever actually speaking to an artist, whereas the Small Publishers Fair felt like an opportunity to meet with the people who are actually producing these books. So, full disclosure, I'm doing a PhD in poetry. I don't usually work with statistics, but I have been very careful in how I've represented this. And I think that using pie charts feels right to me because I just want to give a sense of proportion rather than giving you any sort of more specifics here. So you can see the breakdown of regions in London and Dublin at these book fairs. On the left here, 42% of the exhibitors at the Small Publishers Fair are London-based themselves. 47% at Dublin Art Book Fair were based in Dublin. You know, this makes sense. These major capital cities have higher concentrations of artists and publishers. Hosting them in major transport hubs obviously allows other exhibitors to travel in. But interestingly, this pattern wasn't repeated elsewhere. I briefly also was looking at the Bristol Artist Book event, and actually only 16% of exhibitors there are Bristol-based. The Fine Press Book Fair in Oxford, only 9.5 were based in Oxfordshire. So again, that speaks to the character and the demographics of these fairs. So I think we shouldn't be too quick to assume that simply going to regional book fairs gives access to regional artists. You know, London-based exhibitors ended up being more represented at Bristol and Oxford than local artists. So it really underlines a challenge facing institutions like the British Library. There's no guarantee that these fairs will actually offer a representation of the local region. And it also doesn't guarantee that your acquisition activity will end up being London-weighted again. So the good thing about these regional fairs is that they do actually show where these clusters are popping up places around Bristol where you have UWE, you have these sort of traditions of, bookmaking and publishing and printing, these educational centres. Also some smaller clusters around places like Gloucestershire, where you have Stroud book artists who meet regularly as a local group. So I think this project really gave a sense of where everybody is. So being based in Belfast, I am used to navigating the complexities of cultural interchanges between Britain and Ireland, which is a diplomatic way of putting it. And I think I was well placed to consider the relationship between collecting in Britain and collecting in Ireland in the context of the British Library, especially timely considering the department recently changed its name to Contemporary British and Irish. So I considered Ireland specifically because it brings up all these interesting questions about legal deposit. So books produced in Ireland fall under the legal deposit remit for the British Library, but then the UK Web Archive can't archive any online material hosted outside of the UK. So we started a UK Web Archive collection attached to this placement so that I could sort of record the artist websites I was coming across. And then I realized that anyone who was based in Ireland couldn't actually be added to that collection. So there are all these sort of differences that have to be navigated, thinking about the remits here and where this data is being collected and how it might be used. So it's really highlighted the considerations that have to be taken into account when you're navigating geographical distance, but also cultural difference. Something I discovered quite early on was that the term artist books isn't really used in Northern Ireland. I spoke to a few artists who make artist books, and I asked them, why is it that we don't have so much of this going on in Belfast the way that there would be in other cities? And the anecdotal evidence that I was given was that, and I couldn't really work out whether this was policy or whether this was a perception, but there was this understanding that if you apply to Arts Council NI funding, if you stray too close to your work being considered a publication, it falls under a different scheme. So you might end up excluding yourself from certain funding initiatives aimed at visual artists. So I don't know whether it's more artists being nervous to sort of be classed as, producing an exhibition catalogue, which doesn't then qualify for support as an artwork, which is a whole other can of worms. And also then the visual arts culture is a little bit different. In the Republic, there was a much stronger sense of multidisciplinarity. A lot of these artist book makers were coming to artist books as a sort of one-off project, rather than it being a long-standing practice. There were far more exhibitors, places like the Small Publishers Fair in London, who had studied book arts, who had been working as bookbinders, who'd sort of engaged with the book throughout their careers. In Dublin, you had a lot of photographers, you had a lot of writers, painters who were sort of experimenting with the book, and it was maybe something that they would do once or twice and then not repeat, which then obviously complicates that sense of trying to build these relationships and support artist bookmakers' careers. I also was able to use the National Irish Visual Arts Library collection as a source, but I realised that in the Republic of Ireland, artist books, as used by institutions like NIVAL, refers also to photo books. It refers to even flyers that have been given out at exhibitions. It's really any printed material that might be related to an artist in any sense. And obviously that's really worth collecting, but it didn't fall into the scope of this project, which was much more about the artist's book. And finally, just thinking about Irish identity, not every publisher or artist in Ireland would necessarily feel comfortable having their work be collected through legal deposit for the British Library, even though that's the legislation and that's the expectation legally. There's a lot of sensitivity that's required when dealing with artist bookmakers in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, where there's so many different senses of national identity. Someone might feel that they're British and Irish, or feel that they are Irish only, and therefore the British Library is sort of navigating how they approach artists and publishers as the British Library. But there's a growing partnership with Trinity College Dublin, for example. So there are ways to address it that feel collaborative, that feel supportive, rather than making an artist or a press feel like they're sort of having anything imposed on them. Okay. But actually, to talk about a book briefly, this was a book that was exhibited at Dublin Art Book Fair, and it was actually launched officially at the event. And the artist Lauren Galt was there to give a talk about her experience of making the book. And I felt that this was a fantastic example of how exciting and interesting the sort of artist book scene felt in Dublin. So Lauren Galt, she is a Northern Irish artist originally. She's based between Glasgow and Dublin. She produced this work off the back of an installation at Temple Bar Gallery. So that was really interesting because it meant that the same work was returning to the same space but in a different format. She was able to have it hosted in the art gallery, and then a few months later launch her book at the art gallery's book fair. So this work was really exciting. It really explored the relationship between hybrid forms, fluidity. There was sort of these sculptures of dogs morphing into wolves. There was a film installation about a dog being attacked by a wolf. There was this fantastic solar panel system that some engineers from Trinity College designed. It was outside the gallery, and as the sun rose and fell during the course of the day, the music that was composed for the installation changed in volume, so it was a really multi-sensory, inhabited experience. The work is called Galolith, which means milkstone. It's a bioplastic that's created when you treat milk protein with formaldehyde. So the whole sort of engagement with this work was with themes of fluidity and hybridity. And then I think for her, that really informed her decision to create a book. This sort of went beyond being just an exhibition catalogue. So she had essays, she had quotes from critics, she had sort of creative responses. She also included this plastic sleeve with a piece of Galolith and a piece of the solar panel and other pieces of material of structures that were actually in the gallery. So it really let, rather than just being a record of an art installation, it let the viewer, the reader, take part of the installation home with them and hold on to it. So for Lauren Galt, she said that crafting a book allowed her artwork to be another body and to act as a fluid artifact. So even the language she's using there is really reminiscent of the actual aesthetics and themes she was engaging with in the original installation. So for her, the book was very much a natural progression of the original work, not just a separate exhibition catalogue. But it was sort of being marketed as sort of a hybrid between those two things. So when a work like this exists on the boundary, then that, I feel, becomes a challenge for collectors, especially in an institution like the British Library, where you're sort of thinking about these scales of bookishness, as Jerry has said, where you're trying to determine whether something really is an artist book, whether it's an exhibition catalogue, because obviously some exhibition catalogues aren't engaging with a book form as a sort of function of the art. It's sort of a separate thing. It might not even have much of an input from the original artist. It might just be prepared by the curator at the exhibition. So that was a really interesting work that I then noted down as hopefully a potential for acquisition. So to finish, this project was really exciting. It was really such a pleasure to work on, and it really highlighted some exciting possible opportunities for future development. Fundamentally, it just shows how much a book fair can be a site for data collection, for strategic interventions, for meeting, for interchange, and just for building these supportive relationships with artists. And the challenge will be to target activity around different regional locations to make sure that we're casting a wide net when we're acquiring works for institutions. And obviously the shortcomings that I mentioned earlier, it ended up being limited to regional representation, but hopefully in the data that I've been able to collect and with some of the opportunities highlighted by this research, there might be future possibilities for other researchers to take a different approach and cover more ground. Thank you very much.